Hello and welcome to episode 68 of the Tomato Timer. And I'm really excited to have Priya join us today. Priya is currently the COO of AIME, a mental health app that's offering customized guidance programs with the goal of helping people find the techniques that works best for them for a sustainable routine. And she was previously the CEO of Powercoders, an award-winning social impact startup that runs coding courses and tech job placements for refugees. Priya, this is a long time coming, and I'm so happy to have you on. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. I want to kick off by asking you about this transition into an entrepreneurial life. You started off with a very kind of holistic degree, and you ended up taking an entrepreneurial pathway. What was the reason, and what led you to it?
Well, I think I fell into the entrepreneurial journey. I wouldn't say by chance,
Mhm.
but I think I saw it as the most direct, hands-on, and I'd say efficient way of allowing me to create impact, which is sort of very much the center of my goal. It actually happened because between my bachelor's and my master's, I have a
Mhm.
political science background. I was working at a big data NGO called Flowminder that used sort of mobile data, anonymized mobile data, and sort of satellite imagery as a way
Mhm.
of informing humanitarian missions and policy making. And the NGO was actually started by a Swedish gentleman called Linus. And perhaps I'm getting some of the sequence of events wrong, but he actually started the NGO in response to the Haiti earthquake,
Yeah.
where it was a huge humanitarian disaster, and there was a big issue in aid delivery because they were delivering aid to the capital, Port-au-Prince,
Mhm.
but a lot of people had actually fled the capital and were in other areas, and so he essentially saw a major issue and realized that mobile data and sort of mobile data tracking movements could be a very effective way of informing aid and making it a lot more effective. And so again, perhaps I'm getting the sequence of events wrong, but I think he really just jumped in because he saw a problem and he saw a solution. And so that was sort of a really inspiring approach. And at the same time, while I was doing my work in that NGO, it was during the refugee crisis where thousands and thousands of refugees were being resettled across Europe and
Mhm.
restarting their lives, fleeing from persecution and conflict. And they struggled to find jobs, economic opportunities, to really sort of sustainably rebuild their lives, despite having skills and previous careers.
Yeah.
And so we felt quite powerless. And I have an immigrant background, so it's something that touches me quite strongly. And at the same time, working in a sort of data-centered NGO, I really realized also how difficult it was to find quality IT talents. There was a massive shortage in the market.
Mhm.
And so a colleague of mine actually at Flowminder and I were sort of really talking about this refugee crisis and how we could support and help. And we realized that one potential solution would be to reskill refugees with IT skills, since that was such a highly demanded skill set and one that was so difficult to find in the job market. And so we really sort of jumped in with a hands-on approach in our free time and
Yeah.
organized coding courses. So computers were donated, the teachers were all volunteers, and regardless of the sort of quick and bootstrap start, we were able to build a team of 15 volunteers and train 35 refugees. And so that really showed me how sort of effective and how direct the impact can be when you sort of jump in and try and solve a solution. And so that was a little bit how I started my entrepreneurial journey. And then we had to scale down our operations because I went to London to do my master's. And after that, I joined Powercoders as their CEO, which was an NGO that also offered intensive coding courses to refugees with the goal of job integration. And so it was, I think, really, I mean, there are many ways to make impact, but for me, it was one that was very direct, hands-on, and if you see a problem and can build a solution, that was a very powerful way of creating impact.
Amazing. One thing that strikes me and is something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, trying to figure out, is this combination of impact and startups and entrepreneurship. And in both cases, not right now, but in the past two kind of entities you're involved with, they were NGOs, and yet they were also very, very startup-like. They were very agile, they were very lean, and they were doing stuff in a very hands-on way versus maybe more historic NGOs, which have kind of been set up in a more um, bureaucratic, organized fashion. So there is, of course, even in the years since you've launched Powercoders, there's been a huge transition in how startups consider their impact, how this new kind of brand of social impact startups have come out, and how they're doing really, really great stuff and being aligned to global frameworks. But even before that, or as we kind of have this transition, and people try to understand whether they consider themselves as a not-for-profit, an NGO, a charity, or a kind of a profit-making business. Have those identities ever made you feel like limiting in how you approach the problem? Because I don't think everything that you've done is very much still impact driven and very, very entrepreneurial. It's like I'm sure another like VC backed startup would be doing very much the similar practices and have the same skill set as you would have. Is that ever like a challenge, kind of matching those identities and those requirements?
No, I don't think so. I think sort of skills, startup skills are not sort of unique to a for-profit organization. And I think we've really seen a rise in startups and NGOs that really operate in the startup way, which is sort of results-driven, efficiency-driven, and also sort of very, very focused. And I think that sort of the skills that you learn when running an NGO like a startup are incredibly valuable. I mean, that said, I think that sort of bigger NGOs work on maybe much more complex and much more structural issues. And so I think sort of a bigger bureaucracy is not a negative thing. But there is something to learn from the way startups are run. This sort of focus on efficiency, this focus on results and goals and being very clear about what you want to achieve and how you can achieve that in a lean way, I think is something that can be sort of really, really learned from bigger NGOs, and I think has a lot of value when you apply it to creating social impact. Of course, I think for most nonprofits, the issue sometimes is financial sustainability. So I think that marrying these two worlds is not a bad thing. It's actually something that can sort of bring the next generation of NGOs and the next generation of organizations that approach social impact in maybe a more sustainable way.
Yeah, absolutely. You kind of mentioned the segue in your kind of journey from your bachelor's degree, heading off and working on developing your own NGO, heading back for your master's, and then going back to Powercoders. Tell us a little bit about that, kind of like, especially that master's, because I feel like that you were already in an entrepreneurial pathway. Why did you decide to go for another qualification, and how has that added value to what you do today?
So I did my master's at LSE in local economic development, and the master's focused a lot on sort of creating economic development on a local scale. So really sort of bringing innovation, bringing sort of economic opportunities to sort of cities or towns. And I thought that was very interesting because it's an approach that I hadn't learned about, and I thought that it had a lot of potential. That said, I actually found that I didn't really use so much of the content of my master's in my work, just because then I went back to refugee empowerment and economic empowerment. But I think that it really brought a lot of value in other ways. Like a social sciences or economic development degree allows you to see the gray in things, to really understand that things exist in a bigger system, and there's a lot more complexity in creating impact and creating sort of economic opportunities, and that it's important to take the entire big picture into account when building solutions. Otherwise, they won't be as effective and also as sustainable. And another thing that I think I really learned from my degree was that it's very important to engage stakeholders. So if you're building a solution to create change, it can't happen in a vacuum. You need to engage stakeholders. You need to bring in the relevant people, and you need to create a solution that is inclusive and that takes into account, the issues and the people that you're trying to help.
Did you say, I don't know if I misheard, but did you say that a social science degree allows you to see the gray in things?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really allows you to see the complexity, but also the sort of systemic structures that exist behind issues. And I think that that's absolutely crucial when building a solution, is to understand that, there's not a black and white solution to problems, but that they exist within a more complex structure. And if you really want to create change, it needs to be obviously direct change, but also systemic change for it to be sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And oftentimes we do go in this polarized view just because it's faster, smarter, and especially in the startup space, we need to get stuff out so quickly. We're unable to do deep thinking, and I'm sure that having the space to pursue a postgraduate qualification maybe gave you that time as well. And I think my next question is a little bit something you've already probably touched upon, but what is the social problem that's closest to your heart?
That's a tough question.
Mm.
There are a lot. I think the social problem that's probably closest to my heart is that of unequal access to opportunity. I come, as I mentioned, from an immigrant background. I'm half Indian, half Italian, and my Indian grandfather was the first person in his village to be educated. And that education really gave him access to opportunities. He built a career in the UN. And I mean, the ethos that I grew up with was that if you do have access to privilege and opportunities, you should leverage those to create opportunities and privilege for others. And I think that holds true for many issues. And unequal opportunities really limits. It really is a huge limitation, both in terms of education, access to jobs, but it can even be access to mental health support. Sort of unequal opportunities really dictates how lives run and how the lives are formed. And so I think that that's a major social problem that's very close to my heart.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that and the flavor of education is exactly what my kind of it's a difficult thing to say. What's the favorite problem you're solving? It sounds a little bit like a weird question to ask, but I also, at least for myself, I think that we do need kind of an angle towards the problem solution we're trying to work on, because otherwise the world has a whole bunch of many problems, and generalist and specialist arguments and all that kind of stuff comes into it. And I feel like in some ways that's why like the SDGs have been really helpful, at least for me, because they help categorize and allow you to, even if you're working on multiple goals, you have some sort of like framework and guidance towards which problems are kind of like affecting you and how can you be addressing them. And especially if you go down to the sub goals, it's so incredible how the kind of the granularity with which you can approach problems, because I went in with this kind of bigger theme of addressing educational access, and then I went into it, and then you talk about basic literacy, you talk about lifelong learning, you talk about access to post-secondary education. You're like, wow, okay, so this breaks down, and each one is a problem worth solving because it's addressing and affecting millions of people, but it gives you a little bit of like kind of more clarity and how you approach it. And at the end of the day, you need to be kind of part of that ecosystem of people solving a problem versus simply, agonizing over the spilt milk and just like, I can't read, there's too much to do. So I appreciate kind of like you kind of unpacking that a little bit for me. I want to transition back to kind of refugee education and skilling. What is your feeling on the difference between economic empowerment and aid, philosophically? Which I don't know if you want to talk about preferences or the kind of advantages and disadvantages of the two.
Well, I think it's a complicated question, but I think they're very interrelated. Sort of if I call back sort of the work we did at Powercoders, our central focus and central mission was economic empowerment. And I think it's really important that sort of any social impact initiative, especially one that aims to change lives for the better, sort of economic empowerment and sustainable access to opportunity has to be the end goal, because it's the only sustainable solution that will really create sustainable change and sustainable impact. That said, at Powercoders, our focus was not just on training, but it was really on job integration. So our metrics of success were not the amount of students that graduated. It was really how many students were able to get an internship after the program, and then how many students were then able to get a job, which I think is really crucial, because that's a sustainable and a long-term solution. That said, we really relied on the fact that our students' basic needs were being met, by either through government support or other programs, for example, access to accommodation, access to financial support, food. And so I think that aid plays a major role, because you can't really economically empower someone unless their basic needs are being met. It's a crucial condition that needs to exist before you can do the work of economic empowerment. And so I think sometimes people see them as one or the other. I see them as very interrelated. You need to create conditions where people have their basic needs being met, because if they're not, then it's hard to invest in your future if you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, or where you're sleeping at night. And so I think that a lot of aid initiatives only focus on aid, and that definitely is problematic, because it's meeting a short-term need, not a long-term need. But both need to be considered when you build solutions and when you build initiatives.
And kind of expanding more on that, when we're considering refugee crises, but also like other natural disasters, which are now more and more occurring because of the climate change. Again, we're in this kind of conundrum about like going in and solving the problem, because people are hungry, people are hurt, people are unwell, and people need support, and that's aid. But at the same time, with the kind of like short attention span of human beings at this generation, or in this time, combined with sensationalism, where you're kind of getting news and things pointed out at you on your social media feeds, which are forcing you to do something in an immediate stage, but then don't want to follow through. Like how do these two continue to play a role, or how do we ensure that kind of moving forward, these aid organizations, or kind of they integrate this kind of, yes, we've solved that immediate crisis, but then we've also supported to ensure that there's build back better. There's some form of like continuation beyond that one moment where a disaster struck and people were left in a very, very difficult condition, because oftentimes though their homes were destroyed, their jobs were gone, they don't have anything else to do. So like it's almost like the impact of aid can last for a few days, hours, years, and then how do you kind of make that long term with empowerment?
Yeah, I mean, a big issue is the short attention span of issues. And as you say, a disaster is sensational, but long-term work is much less, but very important. So I think that is a big issue. I mean, the solution to that is, I think, very complex, and perhaps sort of the way we finance aid and sort of economic empowerment initiatives needs to be rethought. But I would say that, I come back to my earlier point. I mean, aid is crucial, and it is absolutely essential, especially in situations like disasters or sort of major disaster situations. But I think many aid programs are built with a short-term idea in mind. And I mean, I may be wrong, but I think a lot of sort of aid programs are also not built in collaboration with economic empowerment programs. They tend to be kept separate. And the ideal would be to really have, aid programs that are very much married and very much built in close collaboration with a long-term view. So not just putting a Band-Aid on the problem, but really treating the problem. Which would also be very economically efficient, because you will always need aid unless you build back better and you build sustainable solutions. And so I'm sure that it happens, but I know that a lot of UN agencies work kind of in a vacuum, and they only deal with their mandates. And I think sort of a lot of sort of cross organizational, cross border collaborations would be very important when you build solutions.
Yeah, for sure. And I want to now transition to your current work. You went from Powercoders and you're now leading AIME Health, which is kind of looking at mental health in a much more non-stigmatized and generalized way. I would love to learn a little bit more about kind of, once again, what led you to this kind of step in your journey, but also what you're working on, what's kind of exciting you the most right now.
Yeah, so I mean, mental health has been something that's been very close to my heart. I've seen its impact on a personal level through family and friends, but also on a systemic level. And I think COVID really brought this issue to the forefront, the impact of mental health. And something that really struck me were the statistics, the fact that 1 in 4 people will suffer from a mental health issue in their life. And actually, after COVID, I think that number has unfortunately drastically increased.
Yeah.
But despite this, over 80% of people actually won't seek help for that issue. And it can be really a destructive and debilitating situation to be in. And we don't treat mental health like we treat physical health.
Yeah.
It's often very underestimated. And I think that's also reflected in healthcare systems and access. So back to unequal access to opportunities, or unequal access to care. Therapy is very expensive. It's often not covered appropriately by insurances. And even when it is, there are just not enough therapists out there. So there's still a problem of supply and demand. There's way too much demand for help and not enough supply. And so that's sort of what we're trying to look into at AIME. We're trying to touch on not just sort of mental health support, but also prevention, because a lot of people that then do reach out to therapists do it when the situation has gotten very bad. And based on our research, we found that there are sort of 3 major dimensions that can really help you improve your mental health at whatever stage. The first is guidance. So the ability to understand and note the thoughts that you're having, the emotions that you're having. So to really be able to have a level of self-reflection, and that really requires a high level of guidance. The second is then finding the right tools and techniques that work for you. There are a lot of mental health apps out there, but a lot of them focus on just meditation, which can be an effective technique. But for many, it may not be. And there are a lot of other proven tools and techniques out there that could equally help you make progress. And a lot of people just don't know. And then the third is consistency and routine. So really being consistent and maintaining a mental health routine and integrating it into your daily life so that you can really make progress on the long term. And so we're building an app that offers really personalized step-by-step guidance that walk you through your symptoms, allow you to better understand also the thought patterns that lead to these feelings. And at the same time, through these guided journeys, we introduce them to various proven techniques and tools in a way that allows them to understand sort of what's most effective for them. And this is all built with the end goal of allowing them to build their own personal mental health routine and really staying consistent. And our goal would be to not just address people that are in a really bad state with their mental health, but people that maybe are at the beginning stages of anxiety, stress, low self-esteem, sort of a lot of issues that can then morph into something a lot more serious and a lot more limiting in terms of their life. And to really allow them to sort of build the right tools, build the resilience that they need to then make progress and improve.
Amazing. I'm sure it's a critical problem, but also I appreciate the kind of the holistic nature with which you're approaching the solution, and as you said, considering it before you end up in a very, very bad situation. We're almost at the end of our time, but I wanted to ask one final question from you. What is one piece of advice you would share with yourself as you were just starting your bachelor's degree at Bristol?
Ooh, I think one that I'm still learning on is this idea of not being too hard on yourself if you make mistakes, if you don't have sort of the perfect solution, and this idea of sort of learning from failure, asking for help, sort of brainstorming with people. I think that's a lot of entrepreneurs, and especially entrepreneurs that are centered around social impact, want to see results immediately, and if they fail at that, they feel like they've failed the mission. And I think that I very much took that very personally in my past career, and so I would say that entrepreneurship is an experience and it's a learning journey, and you should accept failure, learn from it, ask for help, which I think is a standard advice for many entrepreneurs, but it really is one that I'm learning a lot from.
Yeah.
And then another one that I think has really helped is when things seem massive and huge in terms of their importance, big decisions. It's really helped me to ask myself, what's the worst that can happen if I get this decision wrong? And short of I will die or everything will be ruined, the decision isn't so scary, and you have to take a chance and make a decision that you think is right, and it takes a lot of the pressure off it when you ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? And when you work with refugees whose lives have been turned upside down, the worst that can happen, actually, if you put it into context, is not that bad. And so then I think it allows you to make quicker, better, and less stressful decisions.
Absolutely. Don't be too hard on yourself. I love this. And I think it's something I'm going to take away because of past few stressful weeks for myself as well. So thank you so much, Priya. It's been a real pleasure. And I'm so glad we finally got to do this together.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.